My presentation is entitled Kierkegaard's Cross-Pollination of Southern Literature, Reading Wright's The Long Dream and Percy's The Moviegoer. In 1932, very few Americans, aside from those of Scandinavian extraction, had an acquaintance with the work of Søren Kierkegaard. This was the year in which the Episcopal clergyman Walter Lowry, at the age of 64, began his study of the Danish language in order to become a translator of the Danish philosopher. Soon, one Lowry translation after another began to appear in print, as well as his two-volume biography of Kierkegaard in 1938. From this year to the mid-1950s, the existential philosopher's formulations of dread and despair captured the imaginations of many Americans, since these concepts defined the human condition of that era. From the escalation of the Second World War to its apotheosis in Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the Holocaust, to the ubiquitous unease of the Cold War, American culture seemed as though it were driven by Thanatos. According to the English émigré poet W. H. Auden, this was an age of anxiety. Indeed, a book-length poem by Auden entitled The Age of Anxiety was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 1946 and became emblematic of its period, as its characters are racked with paralyzing existential angst. During this era, Auden was just one of countless artists in the United States avidly reading Kierkegaard. In keeping with the theme of circulations between Scandinavia and the greater Caribbean region, this presentation will focus on Richard Wright and Walker Percy, the two authors of the American South who were perhaps most profoundly influenced by Kierkegaard. As we shall see, Wright was above all interested in Kierkegaard the psychologist, and read the Dane's work as part of the continuum of existentialism stretching to his present day, with the atheistic French existentialists. Kierkegaard provided both Wright and Percy with philosophical and fictional inspiration, but he, in addition, prompted an existential transformation in Percy himself. For all of Kierkegaard's enviable literary qualities, he remained for Percy a religious exemplar, whereas Wright was quick to gloss over and secularize the spiritual aspects of the Kierkegaardian authorship. As the cases of Wright and Percy exemplify, fiction writers in the American South were drawn to Kierkegaard for a diverse array of reasons. Rather than accusing some of these authors of a strong misreading of Kierkegaard, I would suggest that this phenomenon is an outcome of the open-endedness of Kierkegaard's pseudonymous authorship. As per his design, the reader is not told what she or he is to take away from the book, and since the books are pseudonymous, she or he could not ask the author even when he was alive. Wright and Percy, like Kierkegaard's other readers, found themselves stranded in an aporia with an ambiguous body of texts, and therefore, based on their very different backgrounds, it should be unsurprising that they arrived at vastly different conclusions. The grandson of slaves, Wright was born in 1908 on a plantation near Roxie, Mississippi. As the son of a sharecropper, Wright experienced conditions akin to slavery during the period of the Jim Crow laws. After the abandonment of his father and the illness of his mother, Wright drifted between the homes of relatives living in the South. In Memphis, he discovered the works of Henry Louis Mencken, whose critique of the South confirmed everything that Wright had long felt, and convinced him that literature offered the only means of liberation. Soon afterwards, in 1927, Wright moved to Chicago to pursue his ambitions as a writer. After being recruited by the John Reed Club, a coterie of left-leaning artists, Wright joined the Communist Party in 1934. In 1940, he published his first novel, Native Son, which was a bestseller and Book of the Month Club selection. Moving from Chicago to New York, Wright still encountered racial discrimination, and dreamed of emigrating to France. He visited Paris in 1946, and then moved there with his family in 1947. Here Wright further developed intellectual and personal relationships with Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and Albert Camus. Wright's Native Son and his autobiography, Black Boy, informed the existentialism of Sartre and de Beauvoir in What is Literature and The Second Sex, respectively. Moreover, Sarah Rellier has suggested the possibility that Wright's conception of the white gaze and its power over the protagonist of Native Son had a direct influence on Sartre's theory of the look in Being and Nothingness. Sartre in turn exerted an influence on Wright's novel The Outsider, the first of three novels Wright produced during his time in France. Although Sartre and other French existentialists are conspicuously absent from the library of the novelist's existentialist protagonist, the narrator, in any case, with his references to bad faith, proves to be a reader of Sartre, as was Wright himself, of course. Above all, the novel's absurd, violent world of clashing political factions is redolent of the atheistic French existentialism of both Sartre and Camus. One must note, however, that Wright's engagement with existentialism predates his flight to Paris. Regarding his departure for Europe, Wright wrote in a 1946 letter on March 15th to Gertrude Stein, quote, "I'm bringing a good deal of the work of Kierkegaard, English translations, of course," end quote. As Wright notes in a diary entry, on June 11th, 1945, he had bought both Kierkegaard's The Sickness Unto Death and The Concept of Dread. It was during this wartime period that Wright is reported to have declared, quote, "Now Kierkegaard is one of the great writers of today," end quote. Indeed, Wright often kept The Concept of Dread on his person. His affinity with Kierkegaard is also apparent in a remark he made to the journalist Cyril Lionel Robert James, quote, "Everything he," that is Kierkegaard, "writes in those books, I knew before I had them," end quote. When he died in 1960, Wright owned 14 works by Kierkegaard and a number of secondary sources on him. Of the 3 novels Wright produced over his 13 years in France, The Outsider was by far the most successful. The other 2, Savage Holiday and The Long Dream, did not fare very well with critics. The Outsider is also Wright's most overtly Kierkegaardian novel, a fact that has been duly noted by scholars. It contains not only an epigraph by Kierkegaard, its protagonist, an African-American Chicago postal clerk named Cross Damon, owns Kierkegaard's books and suffers in the thrall of Kierkegaardian dread and despair. Mary Emma Graham asserts that, in The Outsider, Wright was deepening his analysis of modern racism through the useful prism of philosophical existentialism, end quote. Concurring with Graham, Paul Gilroy elaborates further that the author of The Outsider was not straining to validate African-American experience in their, that is, existentialist authors, European terms, but rather demonstrating how the everyday experience of blacks in the United States enabled them to see with a special clarity of vision, a dreadful objectivity, the same constellation of problems which these existentialist authors had identified in more exalted settings, end quote. Rather than trace the well-worn theme of Kierkegaard's influence on The Outsider, I propose instead to focus on his role in The Long Dream, a work that has received next to no attention in this regard. One exception to this would be Catherine Fishburne's Richard Wright's Hero, The Faces of a Rebel Victim, which argues that The Long Dream's protagonist, an African-American youth named Fishbelly, exhibits a form of despair cataloged in Kierkegaard's The Sickness Unto Death. Jennifer Elisa Veninga has also suggested that Kierkegaard's influence may be discernible in this last novel. She writes, quote, "Fishbelly experiences a similar kind of alienation and fear to that experienced by the characters in Native Son and The Outsider. But the novel focuses more on tensions of family relationships and sexuality than existential dread," end quote. Yet, as I shall demonstrate, familial relationships and sexuality are inextricably connected to Kierkegaardian existential dread, and this decidedly holds true for its depiction in The Long Dream. It is in this sense that The Long Dream, much more earnestly than The Outsider, engages with Kierkegaard's Begrebet Angst, translated by Lowry as The Concept of Dread and Ryder Tomte as The Concept of Anxiety. Since Wright had access only to the Lowry translation, he uses the word dread throughout The Long Dream. In The Concept of Dread, Kierkegaard's pseudonym, Vigilius Hoffniensis, defines dread as, quote, "freedom's reality as possibility for possibility," end quote. It differs from fear, which, quote, "refers to something definite," end quote. As in The Outsider, Wright at times violates the specificity of the Kierkegaardian term, employing it for his own purposes. Throughout The Outsider, and occasionally in The Long Dream, dread functions as a synonym for fear. In The Long Dream, Fishbelly observes his father, Tyree, amass wealth as an African-American mortician in a small Mississippi town by engaging in corrupt practices with white police and politicians. The narrator writes, quote, Fishbelly knew that someday his father would die and that he would be left alone to grapple with white people, and the idea filled him with dread." End quote. After this fear has been realized, Fishbelly recognizes that, quote, "he had inherited Tyree's position with no way to cope with it, and he was filled with dread." End quote. In these cases, Fishbelly's dread is decidedly un-Kierkegaardian, in that it is synonymous with fear. Since his friend Chris Sims was lynched by white people after being caught in a hotel room with a white girl, Fishbelly's dread has a definite object, and hence it is really fear and not actually dread. In other cases in the novel, however, the ambivalence of Kierkegaard's dread is readily apparent, such as in Fishbelly's decision to move out of his mother's home and into the flat on Bowman Street kept by his father. After Fishbelly stalks out of and slams the door on his childhood home, the narrator explains, quote, "he had made the first step toward meeting a future that lured him as much as it frightened." End quote. That Wright would recognize this phenomenon as dread is evident in the epigraph of Book 1 of The Outsider. Quote, "Dread is an alien power which lays hold of an individual, and yet one cannot tear oneself away, nor has a will to do so, for one fears what one desires." End quote. The quotation, taken from Kierkegaard's 1842 journal, was used by Lowry in the introduction to the concept of dread. Most importantly, dread always carries a sensual connotation for Kierkegaard. His pseudonym, Vigilius Hoffniensis, writes, quote, "Dread is the dizziness of freedom." End quote. According to the pseudonym, in this swoon of weakness, one commits the qualitative leap from innocence to sin, and thus it is through sin that sensuousness has become sinfulness. After Tyree opportunistically escorts the bereaved Mrs. Sims, Chris's mother, home in his car, presumably to seduce her, the narrator indicates that while the virginal Fishbelly has yet to make the leap from innocence to sin, his father clearly has, and he has done so in his sensuousness. Quote, "The car roared off, and he, Fishbelly, felt hot tears wetting his cheeks. He had the sensation of being poised on the brink of a vast void, and he had either to leap across and join his father or remain where he was." End quote. Here Wright borrows imagery from Vigilius Hoffniensis, who writes, quote, "One may liken dread to dizziness. He whose eye chances to look down into the yawning abyss becomes dizzy." End quote. Wright's cognizance of the connection between dread and sensuousness is apparent when Fishbelly anxiously takes leave of his mother, as she suggests that the flat on Bowman Street will become, quote, "a headquarters for whorehouses." End quote. Moreover, the linkage between ambivalent dread and ambivalent sensuousness is made quite explicit when Fishbelly is entrapped by a white girl working for the police. The narrator writes, quote, "The white girl's face floating before his eyes was a dream image that had concerned him almost all of his life, something that he feared so deeply that he had had to choke it down in him, out of sight of his mind, something towards which he had always been drawn with a sense of dread." End quote. While Kierkegaard's dogmatic commentary on Genesis, in the concept of dread, implies the universality of inherited sin, sensuousness, and dread, the violent proscription against miscegenation in the Jim Crow South means that dread, cross-pollinated from Kierkegaard, burns and writes the long dream with a heightened intensity. Walker Percy was born in 1916 into a distinguished Mississippi family, whose roles included a United States Senator. After the separate suicides of his father and mother, Percy was adopted by his uncle, William Alexander Percy, author of the best-selling memoir Lanterns on the Levee, a paean to the traditions of the South. While this Southern upbringing steeped Percy in the Stoic tradition, an education at Columbia University Medical School introduced him to the not incompatible worldview of scientific atheistic humanism. At Bellevue Hospital in New York City, where he was serving as an intern, Percy became infected with tuberculosis and was forced to retreat to the Adirondacks, where he stayed in Trudeau Sanitarium on Saranac Lake. Here he read Kierkegaard and the continental philosophers who followed in his wake, namely Martin Heidegger, Gabriel Marcel, Sartre, and Camus. This curriculum made him question the scientism of the present age and his own decision to pursue the medical profession. Not only did he decide to forsake medicine for a career as a novelist, He also broke with his family's Protestant tradition by converting to Catholicism in 1947. Percy credits his conversion to his reading of Kierkegaard's essay, written under the pseudonym H.H., The Difference Between a Genius and an Apostle. The existential impact of Kierkegaard on Percy was matched by the Danes' influence on the author's literary production. Rather than merely being clever literary allusions, Percy's uses of Kierkegaard reinforce the ethical fiber of his work. Writing Caroline Gordon, Percy confided that he considered himself to be more of a Pascalian or Kierkegaardian moralist than a novelist per se. According to Joseph Ballin, in Percy's first three novels, The Moviegoer, The Last Gentleman, and Love in the Ruins, one, quote, can identify specific textual themes traceable back to Kierkegaard's writings themselves, end quote. The Moviegoer, for which Percy won the National Book Award in 1961, is considered his masterpiece. It contains, in Percy's words, a Kierkegaardian frame of reference. This frame is evident in the novel's epigraph, borrowed from the Lowry translation of The Sickness Unto Death. Quote, the specific character of despair is precisely this. It is unaware of being despair, end quote. And in its epilogue, which refers to the great Danish philosopher, the epigraph perfectly captures the condition of the novel's protagonist, Binks Bowling, who, in spite of a materially comfortable existence as a stockbroker in New Orleans, has a vague premonition of spiritual unrest as he approaches his 30th birthday. Instead of despair, Binks is burdened by everydayness, or malaise. As Binks pursues pleasure in an effort to enliven himself, one finds echoes of the many aesthetes who populate Kierkegaard's first, or aesthetic, authorship. According to Ballin, Binks resembles the pseudonym A of Kierkegaard's Either-Or, who pursues rotation, that is, the cycling through of ever-new aesthetic experiences. Binks writes, quote, a rotation I define as the experience of the new beyond the expectation of the new. For example, one's first trip to Taxco would not be a rotation, or no more than a very ordinary rotation. But getting lost on the way and discovering a hidden valley would be, end quote. In Either-Or, it is no coincidence that A's essay on rotation, entitled Rotation of Crops, a venture in a theory of social prudence, is directly followed by The Seducer's Diary. As the titular seducer, Johannes, puts A's theory into practice in his erotic relationships. Something of a seducer himself, Binks would seem to do the same, as he rotates through trysts with three secretaries who have worked in his office. Marcia, Linda, and now, when the novel begins, Sharon Kincaid. According to Ballin, Percy invokes Constantine Constantius, Kierkegaard's pseudonym for the novel Repetition, when Binks performs a psychological experiment in repetition at a New Orleans movie theater. Binks tells his reader how as a sophomore in high school he saw a Western film, The Oxbow Incident, at a theater on Freret Street. After reading in The Picayune about the screening of another Western at the same theater, he decides to attend and discovers gratefully that, quote, nothing had changed, end quote. This, he declares, is, quote, a successful repetition, end quote. The aesthetic nature of such an endeavor is apparent in Binks's definition of it. Quote, a repetition is the reenactment of past experience toward the end of isolating the time segment which has lapsed in order that it, the lapsed time segment, can be savored of itself without the usual adulteration of events that clog time like peanuts in brittle, end quote. Likewise, the aesthete Constantine travels a second time to Berlin to determine the possibility of repetition. Reading in the newspaper that Johann Nestroy's Der Talisman will be performed at the Königsdatter Theater, he delightfully recollects seeing the same farce performed there previously. But whereas before he laughed ecstatically at the antics of Friedrich Beckmann and adoringly observed a beautiful stranger in the third row, this time the comic actor does not amuse him, and the girl is nowhere to be found. Thus, unlike Binks, Constantine concludes, quote, there is no repetition at all, end quote. Percy's riff on Kierkegaard in the 20th century would seem to suggest that, as per Walter Benjamin, the phenomenon of repetition is much more readily accessible in, quote, the age of mechanical reproduction." End quote. Rather than being an innovative contribution to the long-standing Percy Kierkegaard industry, my foregoing discussion of the moviegoer has been intended to orient those of you who may be unfamiliar with the connection between Percy's debut novel and Kierkegaard. In the time that remains, however, I will attempt to make an original and, I hope, provocative argument. Let us turn now to the moviegoer's epilogue, where the second reference to Kierkegaard appears. Here Binks tells his reader that, in regards to spirituality, quote, "I have not the authority, as the great Danish philosopher declared, to speak of such matters in any way other than the edifying. For another thing, it is not open to me even to be edifying, since the time is much later than his, much too late to edify or do much of anything except plant a foot in the right place, as the opportunity presents itself, if indeed ass-kicking is properly distinguished from edification." End quote. During the Attack on Christendom, in which Kierkegaard railed against the Danish state church, the philosopher presented himself to the reader in a series of articles in the Copenhagen newspaper The Fatherland as without authority. He was neither a reformer nor a prophet, nor even a New Testament Christian. In his implied conflation of edification and ass-kicking, Binks assumes the role of the great Danish philosopher in his journalistic foray against a corrupted and corrupting Christendom. Reflecting back on the novel, one finds that this befits Binks, as he often has remarked on the spiritual slackness of his fellow Catholics in bourgeois New Orleans. With a keen irony worthy of Kierkegaard, Binks says of his uncle Jules, quote, "He is an exemplary Catholic, but it is hard to know why he takes the trouble. For the world he lives in, the city of man, is so pleasant that the city of God must hold little in store for him." End quote. Of his mother, he confides, quote, "My mother is a Catholic, what is called in my aunt's circle a devout Catholic, which is to say only that she is a practicing Catholic, since I do not think she is devout." End quote. Elsewhere he coolly reflects, quote, "Sometimes she mentions God. It strikes me that my mother uses him as but one of the devices that come to hand in an outrageous man's world, to be put to work like all the rest in the one enterprise she has any use for, the canny management of the shocks of life." In terms of Kierkegaard's spiritual anthropology of the sickness unto death, Binks's fellow Catholics are not reposing in faith, but rather writhing in despair. Through the lens of his narrator Binks, Percy positions himself as a reformer of American Catholicism by cross-pollinating his debut novel with Kierkegaard's Attack on Christendom. In conclusion, Kierkegaard's influence of on the 20th century American novel is vast, and particularly concentrated in the literature of the American South. In addition to Wright and Percy, Southern and Southern-born authors such as Ralph Ellison, Cormac McCarthy, Carson McCullers, Flannery O'Connor, William Styron, and even Nobel laureate William Faulkner were all impacted by their reading of Kierkegaard. As the cases of Wright and Percy suggest, Kierkegaard probably attracted each of these authors for a different reason, such as the mirror-like quality of the pseudonymous authorship. Nevertheless, the considerable extent of Kierkegaard's circulation in the region begs the question of his fundamental relevance to the corpus of Southern literature. Although such an inquiry into multiple authorships and the cultural, intellectual, and religious history of a region is more the stuff of a monograph than a short presentation, I will offer the region's profound Christian tradition as one possible explanation in closing. Referring to Christianity in an interview, Faulkner said, quote, "I grew up with that. I assimilated that. Took that in without even knowing it. It's just there. It has nothing to do with how much of it I might believe or disbelieve. It's just there." End quote. Faulkner speaks here to the experiences of countless other authors who were raised in the South, including Wright, whose grandmother initiated him into the severities of the Seventh-day Adventists. Although Wright soon came to reject Christianity, he would always brag about how as a boy he took his religion neat, like a shot of bootleg whiskey. Kierkegaard could well have said the same about his boyhood, as his father brought him and his siblings to the meeting house of the austere Moravian Congregation of Brethren. This early introduction to pietism would forever define Christianity for Kierkegaard, regardless of whether he placed himself within or without it. Although Wright was an atheist in his adulthood, he nevertheless would have recognized in Kierkegaard someone who had also understood the stern demands of New Testament Christianity, and was thus equally far removed from mainline American Protestantism. Through future biographical research, I hope to determine the extent to which a religious upbringing primed other Southern authors for their reception of Kierkegaard. Thank you.